Zambia's president just dropped a diplomatic bombshell, demanding that the UK and Europe return billions in visa fees taken from Africans who were never granted entry. For years, Africans paid hefty fees only to be denied over and over again. Was this just poor policy or a calculated system of exploitation? Let's dig into the truth behind this global scandal. The visa industry, a worldwide machine that few ever challenge, is the silent scandal at the heart of Zambia's audacious demand. Not migration, not tourism, but the application processed to travel abroad, particularly for African candidates. The procedure has transformed over time from a simple formality into a significant source of income. And now, at last, that industry is being brought to light. Since statistics don't lie, let's start with them. African citizens lost more than $67.5 million in 2024 alone as a result of their applications for Schengen visas being denied. Around £50 million were collected by the UK from Africans who were eventually denied entry in the same year. That's more than $120 million that was stealthily taken out in a single year without a single jet ever taking flight. This isn't merely a coincidence though. Administrative overhead is not all of it. What is taking place is a business strategy that is based on the hopes of tourists, students, and families from the most underprivileged areas of the planet. This is how it operates. To visit a relative in London or attend a conference in Brussels, a person of Ghana, Nigeria, or Zambia requests a visa. They pay the entire application amount up front, which is £115 for a normal visiting visa to the UK or €90 in most Schengen situations. Regardless of the result, there is no reimbursement for these expenses. The denial follows, frequently without a hearing, an appeal, or an explanation, and formal letter with a chilly sentence. "We have rejected your application. There is nothing more that can be done." The procedure then comes to a conclusion. However, the cost? It's been gathered already. Multiply this by the hundreds of thousands of African applications that are turned down each year. What you get is a huge border-run corporate model where rejection equals revenue, not a diplomatic service. For example, there would be litigation if a fast food company charged customers for meals they never received. There would be indignation if a university collected tuition from students it had never accepted. However, it seems natural for European countries to charge millions of dollars to turn away African tourists. Why? As the system isn't designed to be equitable, it is designed to both filter and make money. Furthermore, Africans pay more than just cash. Young people who feel unwelcome by society, families that are kept apart, and business owners who aren't given the chance to form international alliances all suffer psychologically. A medical visa for a Congolese woman was refused. When attempting to attend a startup symposium, a Nigerian tech founder was turned away. At the last minute, a Kenyan performer who had been invited was turned down. These are not exceptional instances. Rather, they are typical. This is where it gets even more illuminating. Africa has the highest rejection rates. Comoros, Guinea-Bissau, and Ghana are among the countries with Schengen visa denial rates exceeding 47%. On the other hand, less than 10% of US or Japanese applications are rejected. Completely different results, same forms, same fees. Which raises the question of why the rejection rate so closely tracks the worldwide income divide if this mechanism were actually neutral. The process's implicit presumptions may hold the key to the solution. African applicants are more likely to be rejected due to their unknown financial background, lack of connections, or risk of overstaying. These defenses frequently rest on generalizations rather than personal qualifications. Additionally, they're accustomed to routinely rejecting candidates while keeping their funds. This is economic gatekeeping with a receipt. It is neither efficient nor secure, and no leader has dared to say it aloud until now. That's why Zambia's position is so important. President Pikalima's demand for refunds raises doubts about the validity of the entire procedure, in addition to pointing out excessive expenses. A system in which Europe benefits, Africa pays, and no one accepts accountability. This is not a request made out of weakness. It originates from a continent that has started to realize its power. Rare materials, thriving marketplaces, young populations, and expanding global influence can all be found in African countries. At the European borders, however, Their people are viewed as liabilities and accused of offending others. What will happen then, when Africans begin to view visa regulations as financial traps rather than as gatekeeping measures? What occurs if the continent declines to cover the cost of rejection? Zambia has just started a discourse about that, and it's just the beginning. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Not only was money at stake when Zambia's president called for refunds of visa fees, but a broken promise was at stake as well. Africa has been told for years that international collaboration is based on justice and respect for one another, that the globe is open, and that global movement is a right. But if you pay close attention, you'll discover what Africa is at last demanding. The reciprocal relationship is one-sided. First, let's address the apparent imbalance. Visas are not required for travel to numerous African nations for citizens of the United Kingdom and the European Union. For example, Zambia allows holders of UK and EU passports to enter the country without a visa for a maximum of 90 days. Arrival visas are provided by Kenya. A number of countries, like Ghana, Rwanda, Botswana, and others, have completely eliminated the need for a visa or made it very simple for visitors from the West to enter. Why? The logic has always been obvious. Encourage travel, advance commerce, extend hospitality, and show that Africa is prepared for the world. And Africa came through. Visitors were welcome. They signed business contracts. With much hoopla and red carpet treatment, Western diplomats, investors, and celebrities easily entered African countries. However, what did Africa receive in exchange? Bureaucratic suspicion, silent denials, and closed doors. African travelers must go through a Kafkaesque ordeal just to apply for entry, not to mention the humiliating documentation demands, bank statements, employment letters, invitation letters, return tickets, proof of accommodation, and even biometric data, just to prove they're not a threat, while Europeans pass through African airports with ease and only a stamp. And the punchline is right here. The majority of these Africans continue to face rejection. What precisely is being exchanged? Therefore, if Africa opens its doors in Europe and the UK slam theirs, this is where Zambia's problem lies. For many years, the continent has worked under the false belief that generosity will be reciprocated by the globe if it is open. However, the truth is much colder. Africa has been providing access, but not getting any. This is about diplomatic dignity, not just vacation or tourism, because access to a visa is power. It establishes who can access global education, conduct business abroad, attend conferences, and flee emergencies when necessary. Additionally, it sends a clear message when European citizens are able to fly freely and African citizens are denied access. Your freedom of movement is important, theirs doesn't. When you realize how double standards are used to maintain this disparity, it gets worse. African nations are informed that strengthening their own visa regulations could hurt tourism, deter investors, or make them seem unwelcoming. However, Europe defends its travel bans on Africans as a matter of migration control or security. Therefore, while their citizens are kept out in the name of control, African nations are urged to be open for the sake of goodwill. Zambia's demand for reimbursements reverses this relationship. It goes beyond simply telling us to treat us better. It also says that we will reevaluate our treatment of you if you don't. At this point, the situation becomes geopolitical, because the West will notice if African nations start to reconsider their visa policy, remove visa-free entrance, impose stringent screening for European citizens, or even implement reciprocal visa costs. It's not a meaningless threat. Africa has changed from being a weak player decades ago. The continent has significant clout, because to its rapidly expanding economy, thriving middle class, and vital raw materials for the global green and tech revolutions. It is now beginning to employ it. Some speakers from think tanks and African countries are already voicing opinions that were previously deemed too extreme to be publicly expressed when applying to countries in Africa. Should nationals of the UK and the EU be subject to the same non-refundable fees? Should African nations impose visa quotas on European applicants, similar to the tacit limitations that are applied to African tourists? Should Western embassies' diplomatic access be reorganized until equity is guaranteed? These actions are intended to restore the symmetry that global mobility. If the West persists in viewing African tourists as liabilities, because Africa has had enough of being kind but shut out, of being open but insulted, and of providing welcome mats to nations that treat its people like threats. And now, a question is emerging that few people in Brussels, Paris, or London ever anticipated hearing. When Africa is no longer the only party acting fairly, what will happen? Furthermore, how does Europe defend its actions if Africa opens its doors and Europe slams its? Buried beneath layers of bureaucracy so dense that they function as a fortress, as well as red tape, is the answer. Confusion, delay, denial, and above all, never being held accountable are the goals of this fortress. It is not outspoken claims of discrimination that give the European and UK visa systems their power. It stems from their capacity to conceal themselves behind paper. Prejudice is never used to describe denial. Under the guise of administrative discretion, a lack of close relationships, a vague intention to travel, or the age-old favorite, "you might not go home." Let's dissect that final one. Imagine informing a Zambian entrepreneur with a degree and a job that she may overstay her visa after submitting her itinerary, invitation letter, and financial statements. It isn't a case-by-case choice. Systemic bias disguised as policy is what it is. Additionally, it is the norm for applicants from Africa. The fact that there is no accountability, no appeals procedure, and no opportunity to defend or clarify your position, just a chilly rejection letter, makes it even worse. What about the cash? Gone already. The system is located here. Denial without openness. The ideal fraud. There is no trial, no hearing, and no explanation need. Cashing the check and using good judgment. Africa complied for years. Since the game was designed to appear to be a genuine procedure. The curtain is now lifting though. Deliberate policy is re-examining what was originally thought to be unlucky. Not through laws, but through systems that are made to do just that. To silence, extract, and deny. The data is one of this trap's most informative features. You would anticipate that rejection rates would differ by occupation, location, and level of paperwork if visa applications from Africa were being handled equitably. However, in practice, rejection rates, irrespective of applicant profile or economic background, cluster nearly symmetrically around African nations. Your prospects are the same whether you're a teacher in Malawi or a doctor in Ghana, because your background, rather than yourself, is the obstacle. This systematic method to denial transforms visa systems into nationality-based filters rather than ones based on individual behavior. And among the most extensively screened are Africans. Certain African passports are automatically marked for further inspection before any paperwork are ever checked, as some visa companies have quietly acknowledged. Although it isn't stated in policy, it is silently practiced. And the system may operate without indignation because of this silence. Since no one has been named or accused explicitly, nobody has been able to defend themselves up until this point. Zambia's request for a refund goes beyond a fee grievance. It draws attention to the system that generates those fees, the opaque, unaccountable bureaucracy that exists to safeguard itself, rather than conduct impartial evaluations. First, let's look at the phrase administrative denial. It sounds innocuous, ambiguous, and possibly procedural. In reality, though, it is a weapon. The authority to refuse someone at any moment, for any reason, or for no reason at all, is granted to consulates. Additionally, their decisions cannot be legally contested because they are not subject to review. A vicious feedback loop is produced as a result. African applicants overcompensate by submitting more paperwork, attending more interviews, and incurring further expenses, only to be rejected once more, and the system makes money every time. However, the profit is not solely monetary. A psychological cost is incurred. Self-doubt develops when someone is repeatedly refused without explanation. It conveys to Africans that you are undeserving. They learn that the world is not theirs to discover, study, or influence, that their passports serve as warning signs, that they have conditional dreams, And the most hazardous aspect of all is that because people quit trying as soon as they feel that their identity is at disadvantage. They no longer apply, they give up on hope. That's what this system really costs. Not only did they lose their money, but they also lost their talent, confidence, and opportunities. Africa is suddenly realizing that it has been following rules that were never intended to help it win. What occurs, though, if those who are ensnared in that system cease applying and begin calling for change? We're in that moment right now. It's also the point at which quiet is ineffective. African countries were persuaded they needed Europe for decades, for exchange, for financial gain, for visas, for confirmation. The West created the false impression that Africa was fortunate to be taken into consideration, and that access was a gift. That delusion has now been dispelled. The demand for visa refunds from Zambia is more than just a grievance. It's an indication. It is starting to awaken a whole continent. It also brings with it a powerless realization for the existing quo. Africa has power, genuine, indisputable leverage. It's simply lost the ability to use it. While African nations secretly hold some of the most potent bargaining chips in the world, their nationals are often refused access to Europe and the UK. Now let's discuss raw materials. More than 70% of the world's supply of cobalt, which is needed for batteries in electric cars, smartphones, and renewable energy systems, comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The largest supply of bauxite, which is required to produce aluminum, is found in Guinea. South Africa is rich in platinum and rare earths. Ghana is rich in gold, and Zimbabwe is rich in lithium. Without African resources, Europe cannot make the green transformation. That isn't conjecture, it's a fact. And who has authority over who can access such resources? Governments in Africa. But for years, those governments prioritized tax breaks, trade agreements, and regulations that welcomed investors because they thought that being kind would win them respect. But there was never any respect. Instead, there were bureaucratic haughtiness, aid conditions, and visa rejections. The tone is changing now. African leaders are slowly but definitely starting to reconsider their ties with the West. And diplomacy isn't the only factor. It has to do with policy. Zambia's demand for reimbursements has the potential to spread throughout the continent as a movement for visa reform. Think about Africa as a whole. Citizens of nations who arbitrarily restrict admission to African travelers will no longer be granted visa-free entry. No longer unrestricted access to diplomats from countries that take advantage of African candidates. No more collaboration with embassies that view Africa as a danger instead of an ally. These aren't crazy concepts. These reactions are normal. The subcommittees of the African Union that deal with foreign affairs and migration are already having similar conversations. The concept is straightforward: reciprocal mobility. Our citizenry should be able to travel freely your country if yours is free to do so. We'll review the access we granted you if you refuse us access. Africa's influence becomes clear at this point. Africa's partnership is vital to Europe for reasons beyond minerals. It requires it for trade routes, climate agreements, military bases, migrant control, and diplomatic clout at the UN. Furthermore, African nations have been giving away these benefits for far too long with little compensation. The computation is now evolving. Early indications of this power being used are already apparent. Citing imbalanced diplomatic behavior, Nigeria temporarily halted visa on arrival rights for a number of European nations. In 2024, a European trade delegation was halted by Senegal after its business representatives were controversially denied visas. Kenya started negotiating with other nations to replicate their visa policies based on how they handle Kenyan applicants. All of these actions were warnings, but none were permanent, both sides of the door swing. The irony, this was unexpected in the West. Europe and the UK believed for years that African nations would not resist. They would remain docile because of that reliance, debt, and diplomacy. However, they overlooked something. Africa in the 1990s is not like this. Africa today is more youthful, intelligent, and interconnected. Its leaders no longer feel embarrassed to criticize unfair practices. Its people no longer feel calling for justice. Additionally, rather than acting in desperation, its governments are beginning to coordinate their actions strategically. Though it may have seemed like a lone grumble, President Pichilema's speech is a part of a much larger chorus. One that queries why we should continue to allow you to travel freely here if you continue to deny our people the ability to do so. This is adjustment, not retaliation. And there are two options for the West. Either keep making money off of the status quo or realize that international mobility needs to be reciprocal rather than colonial. Africa is more likely to act the longer it waits. Not separately, but together. Because the visa game shifts when African leaders begin to realize they are the ones with the keys to Europe's supply chains, investment routes, and diplomatic access, forever. Do you believe that Africans should no longer seek for visas? Should it be illegal to go to the UK and the EU? Tell us what you think in the comments section below, and please do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one.